Cool. I guess we can get going anyway. Um, Thanks for all that have just tuned in. I'm aware that there was a lot more people that initially signed up. Unfortunately, I had to restart the AMA schedule here. But just a TLDR, essentially Mark and Reverie and David will be going over all things dYdX grants, Guernsey trust structure, all things Dows, and how they are operated in the current kind of market. I will say that this will be recorded through Twitter, so we will use this to post as a potential video. So for anyone who potentially doesn't want to come up and speak, then obviously just keep that in mind. I guess we can sort of open the question just with a bit of a brief introduction. Mark is Chief Legal Officer at dYdX. David is the Head of Growth and Operations at dYdX Foundation. And Derek works with the Reverie team, who is involved with the dYdX grants program. I guess, firstly, from an open question standpoint, from a broad questions to you, Mark, David, and Derek, I guess, can we just start off with discussing all things Dows? What exactly is a DAO, and the current landscape behind Dows?
I'm happy to kick things off. I guess DAOs, in general terms, are a group that leverages blockchain tech to coordinate a wide variety of activities. Generally speaking, DAOs control assets and make decisions. Some people describe DAOs as like a community that has shared control over a bank account. However, unlike other corporations or other types of traditional organizations, I think DAOs generally aspire to function without centralized intermediaries or institutions. They also make use overall of blockchain tech and open source tech to collectively vote on and automatically enact changes to typically a decentralized protocol. So I think that's kind of a very generalized definition of DAOs, but it's worth noting that we're still early in kind of the DAO development cycle, and this kind of definition is likely to change over time.
Yeah, to build off of David's definition, my mental model for DAOs is basically a digital community that coalesces around a shared vision or a shared goal. It could be a specific product, it could be a specific type of investment or collecting, it could be just like talking about a hobby and finding ways to build cool things related to it. Or it might not even have a specific goal to start with. It might just be a community of different friends and brainstorming ideas. So I think it's both something that describes emergent digital communities that want to coordinate around some new financial behavior, and also on the other end of the spectrum, more like specific mission or product focused digital communities that want to coordinate in a low cost manner.
Awesome. And I guess based on that, like, how do you see the future of DAOs and the way they're operated, both from sort of like a coordination standpoint and also a legal standpoint?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think DAO, first of all, it's hard, right? I think David and Derek did a good job of like describing DAOs, but there's such variety that it's really hard to like narrow in on like how all DAOs coordinate, and like how they'll all think about legal things in the future. But I think if you think of like, I'll put it in the category of like DeFi DAOs in general, right? I think like one of the issues definitely has been difficulty to coordinate such a large group well. And I think there's like a happy medium between too close of coordination where you start losing a lot of people who would otherwise participate in the DAO if things were more open, and then a DAO that is so open that nothing actually gets done, which frankly has often occurred. That also ties closely into like legal factors as well, which is like, early on people weren't really thinking about like what participating in DAO meant from a legal perspective. And I think as like views on that have evolved in terms of like potential risks of participating in them, things like that, there's been more work that have been put into like the legal structures that could fit into DAOs, or legal structures that can assist DAOs while remaining kind of on the outside of DAOs. And I think that itself is also going to continue to evolve. I think right now, one thing we'll talk about, right, is the Guernsey Trust today. And I think that is something that is a standard that is useful in today's ecosystem. But, if you fast forward a year, will it still be? Maybe not, because things are always evolving in this space.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds great. And I guess how do these sort of legal structures and I guess coordination structures around DAOs and working, etc. How is that incentivized? How do these structures change the way people contribute to DAOs?
Yeah, I can take that. I mean, I think there's many ways to answer that question, depending on whether you're someone that's like setting up a DAO or whether you're a contributor. I can talk about it from our angle. Like when we talk to people interested in working for DAOs, one of the main sort of hurdles is it's like, what does it even mean to work for one? If I have a standard job, someone will pay me a salary every 2 weeks. I'll have benefits. They'll send me a W-2. It's all sort of tried and true and well understood. None of that's really sort of like, it doesn't exist for DAOs right now. The only people that are working for DAOs on a consistent basis are creating that kind of job for themselves. They're having to innovate on both the type of work that they're doing and how they're doing it, which means that the total pool of people that are able to actually apply their skill set, whether it's design or development or legal or BD, that pool is massively smaller than it could be. And I think like different structures, whether they're legal or organizational or just others, like it will make it much easier for anyone to start engaging with a DAO, both on a part-time and a full-time basis. So, and there's many ways to do it, and we can get into the details, but that's how I think about it.
I would just add, I think in the context of kind of the dYdX ecosystem, I think to date we've seen 46,000 or so unique wallet addresses that have earned dYdX tokens through our various incentive pools. To me, that's kind of the largest concentric circle of all community members within kind of the dYdX ecosystem. I think if you kind of peel the onion back a little, current holders, there's about 22,000 or so unique wallets that currently hold dYdX or that are staking dYdX to the safety module. That's one level of further engagement. I think beyond that, it's really quite easy to hold the token. I think when people think DAOs, they think, more active contribution towards the growth or development or maintenance of the underlying protocol. And I think that takes a lot of different forms. It could be participating as a delegate. It could be accomplishing certain activities that drive governance or action within the community in some way, shape, or form. And so I think, this concept of like a DAO funnel and thinking through kind of the user acquisition or just the user funnel for DAOs, I don't think all contributors are alike. And I think it's still somewhat to be defined what these different levels of contribution really mean. But from a 10,000 foot view, I think the biggest operational challenge for DAOs is, how do you take the energy of 22,000 pseudonymous dYdX token holders, and how do you help or coordinate all these global users who want to contribute into either working groups or teams that actually create productive output? And I think like at the core, the operational challenges for DAOs is really this concept of like human capital coordination and, payments. And And I think we're starting to see a lot of tooling, which is really exciting, trying to address that. But I do think overall we're still, at the early days of really figuring out how to build tools that operationalize DAOs at scale. In addition to a lot of the legal issues that I'm sure Marc will be able to explain in greater detail than me.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. And I guess then touching on and building on the legal issue side, Marc, can you touch on some of the legal issues that are currently facing DAOs and how that might affect their viability?
Sure. I think there's like three main ones deal with some of these. So I think like the three big ones are kind of the limited liability or unlimited liability, depending on how you look at it, issue of DAO participants and contributors. The second one ends up being basically the ability to sign things, right? It's in an on-chain world, signing off-chain agreements, engaging in off-chain activity in general is difficult. And then the third one has to do with taxes. One other thing that I think comes from all of that is like broader like regulatory risk that might exist. Like we all like know about like the SEC and the risks related to that when it comes to tokens. I also think it's something that like DAOs actually need to pay attention to, depending on the activity that DAOs are engaging in. Whether their activities have like a strong like centralizing force versus a decentralizing force. I think when we see DAOs that like centralize into like very small groups that are the only ones participating, and nobody else really can participate or does participate, that starts creating some risks around the kind of securities laws considerations as well. And the same can be true when it comes to like admin keys that they control of a protocol, depending on what those admin keys allow, what kind of control it gives them, and who it is that's actually acting. Especially when there's like small group of multi-sigs that are making decisions. I think that's where, there's a lot of legal risk, and that's why kind of we need solutions to that.
Awesome. And then I guess from then moving into the Guernsey Trust agreement, what are the benefits of having this trust structure from a user perspective? Why was this, I guess, region, jurisdiction selected ahead of other ones that are already established?
Yeah, so I'll kind of take a step back and like walk through like the thought process on it, which is like if you think of a DAO and you want it to actually be decentralized, what you don't want is you don't want to throw in a entity that is completely centralized into the DAO. Frankly, wouldn't even say like
where's Marc gone? Looks like he's been kicked. I'll just invite him back up.
Marc was about to drop some serious
alpha.
had to be cut.
I guess while we wait for him to come back on, I guess Derek, from your standpoint, sort of how are grantees now going to start being paid? How will the trust obtain sort of stable coins from sort of a oh, here we are, Brill, he's back on.
So I mean, I think grantees, right? They can now receive like payments in general, whether it's through dYdX for international folks or if they're US based in stablecoins. And the idea is that through this trust structure, the program can now onboard to OTC desks or exchanges or any other method and convert a portion of the dYdX holdings into stablecoins. And we plan on doing that. We'll publicly disclose it beforehand. And I'll probably talk about this more later, but the main benefit long-term is really like, if I'm an outside vendor, service provider, I want to interface with the DAO somehow, like there still is, I still need a counterparty to be able to sign contract or to talk to, whether it's like sponsorship deal or if I'm selling a SaaS product or I'm a legal provider. And I think there will be multiple kinds of entities. I don't think there's like, it should be like one trust structure speaks for like the whole DAO, obviously, but I think that's really one of the cooler things that this enables. And I'll let Marc talk about the legal side specifically. And I think the original question was why Guernsey specifically as a jurisdiction was picked.
Okay, well, it sounds like I might have cut out from like the very beginning. So I will not try to go too far back, but also start from the beginning. So if you want a DAO to be decentralized, you can't have a centralized entity that is like part of the DAO. And a lot of times you see these days foundations that are like part of DAOs or that are taking directions from DAOs. And that people are like confounding the idea of a DAO with a foundation in some jurisdiction. But the problem is that that foundation is subject to a government's authority to dissolve that foundation at any point in time, and likely subject to like other actions that the agency can take, which means that really it doesn't fit into the DAO model like very well at all, and really doesn't make the DAO kind of very resistant to one central government's decision making, right? So the first thing is that I think it's important to find a entity structure that is not subject to the same issues as the foundation. I think the second part of it that was important is to try to find something that is efficient from a tax perspective. If you like fast forward 5 or 10 years, what'll happen is tax authorities will eventually realize that there is a ton of capital in DAOs that is being spent and that needs to be taxed by somebody. Like there's pretty much no jurisdiction, other than a few that we'll talk about, that decide that they don't deserve some kind of level of tax. And so one of the best things you could do is try to figure out where it is that you can locate an entity that will create tax benefits. So after kind of thinking through like what kind of entity structure, which includes a trust, would work, and then the question is what jurisdictions have, no taxes or hopefully or low taxes, right? And so, if you pull out the 10 to 15 jurisdictions that fit into that category, and you start going through those, what you'll realize is that, all of them have this trust structure type, which is referred to as a purpose trust. And this purpose trust is useful in that it really aligns interests well with the community, because the purpose trust has one goal, and it is to fulfill a specific purpose, right? And so, you could go and you could think of, frankly, any purpose that you want to fulfill that is aligned with the community, right? So you could think like growing the dYdX DAO, right? Or anything else that you could think of. And now that is the purpose of the trust, and the trustees will be required to fulfill that purpose. It doesn't have any beneficiaries the way a trust often does. And when there are beneficiaries, there's often like tax issues that come with having beneficiaries that don't allow, at least for US purposes, for the jurisdiction of the trust to be considered where it's actually located. And so by finding like a purpose trust in a no tax jurisdiction, being Guernsey, what you potentially have like tax benefits that you wouldn't have if you have an entity that is based in the US. But when you look at these purpose trusts in these various low or no tax jurisdictions, there are several of them that actually have like, again, what I would view as centralizing requirements. So if you look at Cayman Islands and the BVI, both of them require that there be a licensed trustee. And if they're required to have a licensed trustee, that means a government has determined that this licensee is appropriate and also wields control over that licensee, which again means that the DAO is not really independent from, the executive branch's, limited or specific decision making with respect to that entity or that licensee. And so those kind of cuts out those types of jurisdictions. But if you look at both Guernsey and Jersey, both of them have these purpose trusts, and both of them have do not have the requirement that you have a licensed trustee. And so what that means is that you now have a entity type that is going to be created just by private agreement. And so who are the parties to this private agreement? It's going to be the trustees and the enforcer. So the trustees would be kind of typically who you'd think of as like the grants committee. And so they're going to kind of carry out the purpose in the trust based off of the funds that the DAO sends them into the trust. But one thing that has been true with committees in general is that there's really like no oversight of these committees. Once you send funds to a multi-sig as a DAO, although some people have like worked on like mechanisms to claw them back and stream funds instead of bulk payments, but like typically as like a legal matter, there's really probably like no rights against the multi-sig holders like at that time. But with a enforcer, basically what you now have is a person or an entity that is sort of a watchdog over the trustees. And the obligation of that of the enforcer is essentially to ensure that the trustees are carrying out the purpose of the trust. And so now there's a mechanism to ensure that the manner in which the trust is actually carried out is going to be in a way consistent with the reason why the DAO actually sent funds to this trust in the first place. And so now that you have this trust in a jurisdiction that is like low or no tax, you also have the ability to engage in transactions without like tax consequences. That again has like some level of centralizing effect because of the obligation to deal with a governmental agency in the real world, which includes like paying taxes. And so essentially, if you're in a no tax jurisdiction, you want to take one token and swap it for another token. And then you can do that in a transaction without any taxable event in Guernsey. That's something that, in a regular DAO, if you were to engage in that, there is a risk that token holders are deemed to be partners of a partnership, for example, and need to pay taxes on that. So that's like one of the ways in which the trust is useful. On top of that, when you have the trust now, the trustees are allowed to sign agreements. So trustees could go ahead and sign agreements with contributors who are funded by the trust. What are the benefits of that, right? Typically, contributors have been funded. Some amount of funds are withheld, but not all of them, meaning it's really hard to actually get them to perform what they're required to perform. On top of that, once they do, what about the IP? There's no obligation that forces them to do with anything with the IP. But now, when you have a trust, you could sign an agreement with that contributor. The agreement could say that you are required to open source all code created pursuant to a specific open source license that a project decides is appropriate. And so now you have like a legal basis to actually ensure that the work is performed and that the IP is open source, so that not only can the specific project use it, but other projects can use it as well, which is obviously a benefit. And obviously other things can happen. I think Derek was touching on it. Things like entering into OTC transactions, creating exchange accounts, if that were necessary for any reason. Take it a step further, you could even create bank accounts, right? And anything else that you would create with a centralized entity. You can also do things that, typically wouldn't, DAOs haven't really been able to do. DAOs pay everybody as consultants and contractors. But realistically, in some DAOs, you have a lot of consultants and contractors who are putting like limited time into things. But like generally you have core contributors who really are putting in like full 40, 50, 60, 70, whatever hour weeks, and who really are like effectively like employees. And so they should be treated like employees. And that's something that like a DAO can't do. But with a trust, you could actually do that, right? You could create accounts in places and actually comply with employee like payment obligations and compliance there. And so now you're able to sign, you're able to act in the real world, you can kind of grow what goes on. And then on top of that, the trustees can do that with the confidence that they have limited liability. So typically when committees are created, I mean, effectively the committee members are potentially exposing to themselves to real liability with no kind of protection. So what that does is, it causes people to have to take risks that frankly they shouldn't have to take. And second of all, it definitely has like in certain situations causes people to, not participate in a way that they may have otherwise. And so by having this structure, now you've got kind of a group of, committee members, trustees of the trust, who have the ability to participate in the trust, like fully, without having like the risk of liability for totally proper actions that they otherwise could have liability for in a typical DAO.
Thanks for that, Mark. That was extremely interesting. And I guess then for first time founders that are in the space or existing companies that are trying to become slightly more decentralized, are there any general snippets of advice you have from a legal standpoint on, I guess, how to go forward from there?
Yeah, I mean, a few things. I think, like, while founders shouldn't have to like know everything about legal stuff, I think being like aware of them is important. So, like, I think reading stuff on DAOs generally is important. There's not that much, out there. I think Miles Jennings and David Kerr wrote a good paper on unincorporated nonprofit associations. That's something that should be read because it brings up a lot of the issues that I intentionally didn't go into depth on because they did. I think like reading the post that dYdX Foundation put out, I think is a good starting point as well. In addition to the actual like grant, the trust agreement that was put out for that purpose as well. I think the key, really though, is that you're still going to need help in doing this, and so I think like getting that basic kind of knowledge is useful. But ultimately, I think you're going to have to work with some kind of law firm if you're going to want to do this. And the tricky part is that if you go work with like a Guernsey-based law firm, they're not really going to have that much like knowledge on DAOs in general. Like they're going to be very good on trusts, but they're not going to be very good on like DAOs more generally. So I think it's really important to have somebody, on the team who's taking a lead on this, who understands like DAOs very well as well, and like what you're trying to achieve, creating the trust structure or any structure like around the DAO. The other part I'd say is like, I think it's important not to think of like this trust structure as like the only thing that can work or the thing that works in like every case. I also think it's important not to think of it as like the only thing. Like I personally think that a DAO that has created a trust and then runs everything through this trust is probably like not doing things right. Like most likely, you're probably still going to want like separate groups of contributors who are contributing in the DAO. Do I think that means like the separate sets of contributors should probably go and look at this trust structure or another structure like independently, and you should probably have multiple trust structures that are working like independently underneath the DAO? Yeah, I think that's probably like a good idea for teams to consider. So I'd say like overall for like first time founders, it's like read up on some of this stuff, go try to find somebody who really does understand DAOs, hopefully at the intersection of law, but even if they don't, understands like how DAOs should operate well. Third, like don't think of like this one structure as being like the end all be all, although I think it'll be like broadly used and works well within the DAO structure. And fourth, I just wouldn't think of like allowing that trust structure to like centralize you too much. I think it's like important to have contributors acting through different structures that they may choose, and some contributors may choose to act through like a centralized LLC, and then you're gonna like take a different approach with them than you might like with the trust. But I think it's important to like let that happen, and not centralize all things in like one trust.
I guess then for you, Derek, how does this new trust, or what new abilities does this enable for the dYdX grants program specifically?
Yeah, I think overall there's just more flexibility in the types of things that are possible, starting with, like I said earlier, like paying contributors in not just dYdX, but in different stablecoins. It enables the grants program to have service providers outside that only accept stablecoins or fiat. This could include like law firms, it could be like designers, it could be like literally any other area that like a traditional organization might need that also applies to DAOs. Like it's now possible. And then like also touched on this, but if you zoom out, like, and you think about some of the other things that a growing protocol like dYdX needs, whether it's things like sponsorships or partnerships or integrations, like some of these things can be community driven, and proposed by members of the DAO. The Treasury has funds; any community member can propose these ideas and work on them. And like the trust structure or a trust structure is one way to achieve that down the line.
Awesome.
I
Sorry,
think,
David.
yeah, James, I would just add on to what Derek said. I think obviously the dYdX community is excited about version 4, which the dYdX Trading Inc. team is working on, which is a fully censorship-resistant derivatives platform that is set to launch later this year and will be kind of fully decentralized in the hands of the community. I think when we think about decentralization, it's not just decentralizing the product, which V4 will certainly enable, but it's also decentralizing growth and business development and just general marketing. And I think that's in particular an area that like this trust structure really enables. It's a lot of these service providers do not at the current time operate exclusively kind of in a Web3, and that on and off ramp with kind of real world businesses is really critical, from paying salaries to paying contractors to signing legal agreements. The reality is, based on the technology that exists today, it's just not possible to have everything on chain. Certainly it's an aspiration, and hopefully we get closer to there, but from a practical standpoint, to be able to operate that kind of on and off ramp with kind of the real world is a pretty critical nuance that DAOs have to kind of operate around. And so, yeah, I think, again, just to reiterate Derek's point, it's really around decentralizing growth efforts. I think that's certainly uniquely enabled by this trust structure and by the grants committee and program more broadly.
I want to pick up on that one point on decentralizing growth. I think both for securities laws reasons, in addition to just a more trustless growth mechanism, I think it's really important that we don't just think about decentralization from a technical perspective. I think that's generally been achieved pretty well in DAOs. But what hasn't been achieved very well is that you'll have a DAO that controls aspects of a protocol in addition to a treasury, but they're really just focused on further development, which is, I think, important. And they're focused on spending funds on general technical aspects of the protocol. But what gets left out completely is growth, business development, marketing. And those are all things that should be decentralized as well. It shouldn't be an initial development team that carries out those functions. I think that's problematic. It's a central point of failure right there. If growth can't happen other than through this one entity, that is problematic. And I think so the trust structure kind of helps scale that growth function in, I think, under the umbrella of the DAO and in a more decentralized way. And again, there could be multiple trusts that are carrying out different functions. And you see this with, Maker in a way, in the way they function. But I think it's pretty important to focus on the growth, marketing and business development, and how that can be in a decentralized way, done in a decentralized way without putting everybody who is doing that at risk when they're just contributing in their individual capacities with no protection whatsoever for what they're doing.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Derek, for that. And then going down a different path then. So when it comes to sort of delegation and authority delegation, can you just briefly touch on how and why trustees would need to delegate some of their authority?
Yeah, if you think of the trust as carrying out a growth function, for example, for a DAO, you think of a typical business entity, just entity in general. You're going to have like default authority that is granted based off of titles. For example, if you have a CEO of a corporation or a CFO, there's like default authority that comes with that they're entitled to do things on behalf of the organization. That doesn't really exist with trusts. Trusts act through their trustees. And so it's the trustees who do everything. But in a typical DAO, the trustees are not there to carry out like day-to-day functions on a continuous basis. They don't have like the capacity to do so. So they need others to do that, just like in a traditional organization. So contributors are going to want to participate in this way. And so how do they participate in this way, like underneath the like trust structure? And the way they do it is for the trustees to actually delegate some of their authority, to specify exactly what it is this contributor can do. Now, this doesn't mean that contributors can't just come and contribute to a DAO without any kind of authority. Like, of course they do. That should be the case in any DAO. What it allows them to do is come contribute in a way that gives them a certain level of protection, probably an easier way to be funded, potentially, if it's a true employee, benefits. So it gives them the ability to do things that they would like typically see in the real world, but within the DAO structure.
Awesome. And then I guess kind of a global question for everyone here, sort of what's your view on Reverie's role as the enforcer, and specifically Derek, sort of what are the processes Reverie are putting in place to fulfill its duties as an enforcer here?
Sorry, was that a question for me or for Mark?
I guess anyone can answer that. Just regarding processes in place from a Reverie standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from speaking from I guess myself and Reverie, I really see our role as like, first off, like as part of the grants program, like making recommendations to the trustees on what we think like prudent growth strategies are. And it's a pretty broad definition, right? There's a lot of things that could fall under, but it's up to the trustees at the end of the day to execute on them and to process and queue multi-sig transactions to the right addresses. And it's our role as an enforcer under this trust structure to really make sure that they're carrying out these duties in a way that's consistent with the broader goal of like growing the protocol, growing the DAO, which again could mean a bunch of different things. There's a lot of different strategies and subjective ways to do that. But that's sort of our primary responsibility under this structure.
Yeah, and the thing I'll add is like, as the enforcer, like there's no like, I think there's like a very big difference between like being like a watchdog, like big picture, and being like a hawk looking into everything, right? Like an enforcer, and it's actually like specified, like they don't have a right to look into like every single thing that is going on. They have a right to like specific information to like carry out what they are doing as an enforcer. And like you don't want them to be looking at every single thing the trustees are doing. But from a big picture perspective, you do want them to know if trustees are, for example, like funding like projects that are their own, for example. Like doesn't mean like a trustee can't be part of that process, but should they disclose it? And is it ideal if the enforcer is aware of it? Yeah. On top of that, like should the enforcer be aware of like strange like multi-sig transactions that are going in like very large amounts to places that they were never supposed to go to? Like, yes, but it doesn't mean the enforcer is looking at like every single thing that they are doing in detail and questioning it at all times, because that's not going to allow like the trust to function the way it should, and the trustees have more autonomy than that.
Awesome, thanks, Mark.
I think the only thing I would add is like, I think we're still pretty early in terms of defining, what does good governance really mean in the context of DAOs? I think in traditional corporate governance or in political science, I think those systems have taken, decades and, centuries for this concept of good governance to develop. I think one of the lessons learned from, those two fields is that checks and balances are really one of the best mechanisms to ensure good governance. And I think, at their core, I view this delineation between enforcer and trustees as really an additional mechanism for good governance through a legal agreement that like specifically specifies kind of this checks and balances concept. And again, to Mark's point, not every decision has to be checked. The reality is the community can actually track a lot of flows and transactions which typically occur on chain, but the reality is like most community members are not actively tracking and don't have all the information that would be required to really act as the right set of checks and balances. So I think this is generally a very positive development and step forward for just good governance that will result in like more positive outcomes overall.
Yeah, could not agree more. I think to jump off that, like, it's really such a big theme here, checks and balances. I think a lot of communities have kind of a visceral reaction against any kind of proposals or teams or people interested in working like for the DAO. I just tweeted about this like via a meme. Check it out. But and it's because like these communities don't want to hand over large amounts of what they think is large amounts of funding to people that they might not like know super well, or they haven't like they have no guarantees that they'll carry out and work on what they're supposed to be, and the money is just like controlled by like 3 people in a multi-sig, and those are valid concerns to be like, quite honest. And I think like having these checks and balances in place where token holders have the authority to remove Reverie, to remove myself, to remove trustees, if we're not performing our duty up to a specific standard, like that is that the importance and implication of that can't be underestimated, because it allows people to be much more comfortable with taking risk and potentially like spending money to grow the protocol. Without it, I think, I mean, I see this time and time and again in forums and DAOs, like people get lost in the procedural and who's like auditing things. And I think like there's still a lot of work to be done here. This is just the start, but I think this is a great sort of start to addressing those concerns.
Awesome. Thanks, Derek. I guess we've just got under 10 minutes now. Unless Mark, David, and Derek have got anything else to say about the trust structure, I guess we can open the floor to anyone who wants to come on and ask a few questions. So I guess if anyone wants to ask any, just request to come up as a speaker and then we can bring you on.
I have one question. I guess like, Mark, you've been working on with the foundation, like this Guernsey trust model that addresses some of the I think questions and things that people working for DAOs have. Like, what are some of the other like outstanding questions or things that that you're still curious about or think we'll get more clarity on over the next few years from a DAO perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think when first coming up with this trust model, I talked to a bunch of people about it, and after talking to everyone, they were like, trying to get people to like poke holes in it, which nobody was really poking many holes in it. They would say like, well, what are the holes? Like, what's the issue? And frankly, the holes are that like they don't. If you look at the trust model, and you say like, is this the ideal model? The answer is no. The question is though, is it better than a DAO without this trust structure in it? And the answer is like, yes. Is it better than other structures that have been used that are associated with DAOs, like foundations that are like taking direction from DAOs? And the answer, in my opinion, is like clearly yes. So I'd say like the first thing is that this trust is just a I call it like a band-aid at this time to allow DAOs to operate in a way that like really reduces risk, reduces like personal risk, tax compliance risk, things like that. It's not like if you could start from scratch and say like, what would the ideal entity be like, right? It would probably be like an entity that had more like clarity from a tax perspective around things. It would be an entity that had like default authority given to contributors within the entity. Like there'd be a lot of things that you would like change. And I do know people like working, especially in the US, on like a state law level on that thing, right? The Wyoming DAO is an example of that. I think it's like a very unideal structure, but like the concept of people working on trying to find a structure that works for DAOs is going on. And so I would just say that this is something that like makes things better. But what are like some of the big things that stand out? Well, this entity structure doesn't give like limited liability to all token holders, right? So like if you're a token holder and you could potentially be liable under some theory of like general partnership or something else, this structure doesn't actually address that. What it does do, though, is it removes the obligation of the DAO to really act on, everything, right? So the more things that the DAO does through this entity structure, the less things there are for the token holders to be sued for, right? The more that if you were to move all DAO functions into 10 different trusts, and the token holders didn't actually there was nothing for them to actually do other than through these trusts, there'd be very limited things that they could actually be found liable for, because they're not actually taking these actions themselves. Doesn't mean people wouldn't sue anyway, which is why it goes back to this is not the perfect structure, but at least it provides that protection. So an ideal structure would be one that's a lot easier to wrap around a DAO as a whole. I think theoretically, there is a way to make this trust structure work around a DAO as a whole. Not something I've frankly spent that much time exploring, but there's a possibility of doing that. Creates new risks, right? Because you would have to do it with instead of including trustee names, you would essentially have all the token holders being trustees, and you would essentially have them sign Ethereum transactions to agree to sign Ethereum messages to agree to the trust agreement. There's reasons why you'd actually have to have a trust first, and then you'd add them as trustees for very Guernsey specific law reasons. But theoretically you could do that. But now, your fellow trustees are, token holders who you don't have information about. Lawyers in Guernsey definitely are not going to like that, although theoretically it's doable. And so I think having this wrap around the DAO as a whole, this wrapper, but without the centralization that you get from a Wyoming DAO, for example, that is just an LLC, I think is something that we're definitely sorely missing. And then again, with that comes the authority to act within that DAO in a better way as well.
The only thing I would add is one of our objectives here is really to create discussion within the industry. I think clearly, David Kerr and A16Ze's initial paper laid out some of the issues from an operational and legal standpoint with DAOs and proposed kind of an initial structure to address that. I think the dYdX Foundation really took a lot of those initial insights and built kind of version 2 of that document, addressing a very practical solution that we think is applicable to the broader industry, and we expect other communities to take a look at the documents that we've published openly and react to them, and hopefully continue to build and iterate on them. Again, I think to Marc's point, this is somewhat of a band-aid solution that works in the current environment. It may not be applicable to every single use case or address every single downside, but it's certainly better than no structure, as Mark outlined. But certainly this is an evolving field, and I think we're excited to publish really thought leadership at the edge of kind of the legal DAO innovation space, and again hoping to see other communities analyze it, respond to it, and hopefully iterate and continue to make it better, so that DAO practitioners as a whole benefit collectively.
Awesome. And I guess we can just have one last question there. I mean, just Blake, do you want to ask your question?
What does a DAO actually do?
Yeah, I can.
I don't know. That's pretty broad. I know that's pretty broad, but
I can take that. So I think DAOs broadly, they can have a specific product focus. They could have a specific
big time,
just passion or hobby that they, as a group, no different than any digital community, like a subreddit that they just want to chat about with some financial incentives baked in. That's really the most basic, primitive way to describe it, I think.
No, I appreciate that. No, thank you, man. I appreciate that. Thank you. And I know you said you were going to wrap this up in a second. I just appreciate you letting me get on here and stuff, and I hope everybody has a good day today.
Hey, just Blake, maybe also to make it a little more concrete in terms of Web 2, right? Today we're all on Twitter, right? And I think an easy analogy to think about is there's a company and a team at Twitter that makes decisions on whether the Twitter platform allows 140 characters or 280 characters, and that's a decision that really is controlled by a hierarchy and a company that makes that decision, probably with some user input and user feedback, but ultimately it's their decision to make. And I think a lot of Web 2 companies kind of operate in that fashion. I think what's really exciting, in the context of Web 3 and DAOs, is the community and users actually are potentially able to control the actual end product, right? So if the community wanted to make a better Twitter and say, instead of 140 characters, we want the standard to be 500 characters, the community could actually come together, make a proposal, put together code that, if the proposal is successful, would automatically execute and change that parameter on Twitter. Pretty simple example in the context of Web 2, but when you think about the fact that again, this allows kind of community control over products in kind of a new manner, that can be applied to a lot of different types of decisions. And so, again, DAOs are just a very generalized term that really mean different things in different contexts, but hopefully that gives you just a very specific example of relative to the existing products that you may be using.
Awesome. Thanks for that, David. Okay, great. Let's wrap this up. Mark, thanks so much for coming on, spending your time, sharing your wisdom here. Derek as well, thanks for coming on and representing the Reverie team. And David, as usual, from the foundation, thanks for coming on. Also, thanks everyone in the audience for listening in and asking your questions. This is recorded and will be posted on Twitter, additionally for our Discord and on YouTube. So anyone who's late to the party or wants to check it out, then reach out through there. Okay, awesome. I'll end this space now. Have a great day, peeps.